The decaying orbit of the black star around Gargantua B was never meant to be a permanent waltz with oblivion. We were here to study the black hole, to stare into the abyss and quantify the unquantifiable, not to become permanent residents. Yet, with each passing rotation, the station groans a little louder, the artificial gravity fluctuates a little more noticeably, and the once distant event horizon seems to loom a little closer in the viewport of the observation deck. 3 years of staring into the cosmic void, and I'm starting to see things staring back. Not literally, of course. I'm a physicist, not a mystic, but the data, the readings we're getting from the splicer, they don't make sense. Not in any way that fits within the known laws of the universe. It's this damned singularity splicing project that's got me losing sleep and hair. Probably years off my life, if I'm being honest. The idea was preposterous, audacious, bordering on insane, even when Chronicle Corp first pitched it to the United Earth Directorate. Take particles, accelerate them to near light speed, skim them along the event horizon, and then, somehow, quantum entangle them with human neural patterns. Merge with the singularity. The ultimate field trip. Of course, back then it was all theoretical, just equations on a screen and the fever dream of some corporate executive looking to make his mark. And a hefty profit, no doubt. I was younger then, more idealistic, hungry to prove myself. Now I just feel a raw ache where that ambition used to be, replaced by a dread that sinks its claws a little deeper each day. I should have listened to my gut when that initial report detailed the death of a junior researcher, a consequence of overridden safety protocols that were ignored to collect data faster. It was a tragedy that could have been prevented. I should have seen it then. The recklessness, the complete disregard for human life in the pursuit of progress. It wasn't just about the science anymore, if it ever truly was. It was Clara who first voiced serious concerns about the project. Dr. Clara Holloway, an astrophysicist, stubborn as a mule, and the only person on this station who can consistently beat me at chess. We go way back, Clara and I. Back to our university days when we were both bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, full of dreams about unlocking the universe's secrets. We even dated for a while. A brief, intense fling that ended as abruptly as it began. Too much ambition, too much pride, too much overlap in our professional spheres. Still, there's always been a connection, a mutual respect, maybe even a spark of something more, buried under layers of unspoken words and professional rivalry. I remember one particular argument, late one night in her lab, over the ethical implications of the project. She thought we were playing God, and I thought she was being overly cautious. We didn't speak for a week after that. Now I find myself wishing I had listened. She always did have a better head for the bigger picture. I have a better head for numbers, but numbers can be deceiving, especially when they're trying to describe something that exists beyond the boundaries of our comprehension. Then there's Julian Crane, a name that sends a shiver down my spine, even on the warmest deck. Brilliant, yes, but with the kind of manic intensity that makes you want to check if he's carrying any concealed weapons. He was always obsessed with the singularity, saw it as more than just a gravitational anomaly. He used to talk about it as if it were a living entity, a conscious being. Mystical nonsense, I called it, during one of our many debates. He had a way of looking at you, a sort of predatory gleam in his eyes, that made you feel like he was dissecting you layer by layer, looking for your weaknesses. He was one of the first to volunteer for the splicing experiments when the project moved from theoretical to practical, salivating at the opportunity. If anyone on this station was going to embrace the abyss, it was Julian Crane. And he has, quite literally. The experiments began with such promise, such fanfare. The Singularity Splicer, a monstrous piece of machinery that dominates the main research lab, powered up with a deafening surge. We used beams of exotic particles, focused and manipulated with a precision that still amazes me, even now. The initial results were intriguing, perplexing. We observed fluctuations in the local gravitational field, minute distortions in the flow of time within the lab, and strange, almost coherent signals picked up by the QEC, our quantum entanglement communicator. Then came the incident with Dr. Kim, the containment breach. I saw it all on the security feed, the way his body distorted, like a reflection in a funhouse mirror, before collapsing into a shapeless mass. That's when the reports started coming in. The minor system malfunctions, the strange noises, the unsettling accounts from crew members. A technician swore she saw her reflection aging rapidly in a mirror in the mess hall. A security guard claimed he heard voices, as if they were coming from a different point in time altogether. Past or future, he couldn't tell. Each incident, dismissed individually but collectively, they painted a disturbing picture, one that my rational mind struggled to accept. It was after the lab was sealed, after Dr. Kim became an unidentifiable mass of flesh, after the screaming stopped and the alarms were silenced, that I got my first real glimpse of what we had created. A security camera, one of the few still functioning in the sealed lab, caught a fleeting image. A shifting, amorphous mass of flesh, with hands that ended in too many fingers, reaching, grasping. Eyes that opened and closed in places where eyes shouldn't be, and mouths wide, gaping maws that seemed to scream in silent agony. We called it Kronos, after the Greek titan of time, a morbid joke that no one found particularly funny. Dr. Julian, along with a few other researchers, were ordered to suit up and enter the lab to assess the damage, retrieve any valuable data, and initiate cleanup protocols. Dr. Julian was eager to study the effects firsthand. He grabbed onto a railing with excitement, pulling himself towards the airlock with an almost childlike glee. As they entered, the same security camera that showed us the entity caught a glimpse of something moving within the lab, a shifting mass of flesh with distorted human features. The first, horrifying manifestation of Kronos. It reached out and grabbed a researcher by the ankle, and the security feed went black. It was like watching a nightmare unfold in slow motion. I ordered the lab to be sealed permanently. Panic erupted in the lab, alarms blared, and the remaining team members scattered. Dr. Julian made it back, shaken but also somehow excited, babbling about new data and unprecedented readings. United Earth Directorate, spurred on by Chronicle Corp, were less than pleased with my decision to halt the experiments. They wanted results, breakthroughs, their pound of flesh, quite literally. Dr. Julian supported this notion, of course. A debate, if you could call it that, erupted in the command center. Voices were raised, accusations were thrown, and the thin veneer of civility that had held us together for 3 years began to crack. I ordered everyone to their quarters to go over emergency protocols, overriding the objections of Dr. Julian and the other researchers. Back in my quarters, I accessed Dr. Kim's personal data assistant, hoping to find something that could explain what had happened in the lab. His personal log was a mess, a jumble of technical jargon and increasingly frantic observations. He described strange sensations, a feeling of being untethered, his word, from the normal flow of time. The last entry was dated 3 days in the future, a detail that made my blood run cold. The timestamp was accurate. I checked it against the station's chronometer. 3 days from now. How was that even possible? It was then I experienced my first temporal distortion. One moment I was standing in the observation deck, watching the accretion disk of Gargantua B swirl with an almost hypnotic beauty. The next I was in the corridor outside, with no memory of how I got there. I checked the station's chronometer. 6 hours had passed. 6 hours that I couldn't account for. It felt like a chunk of my life had been stolen, ripped away without my consent. The reports from the crew became more frequent, more disturbing. Security Officer Wilson, a veteran of countless deep space missions, was found dead in the armory, his body withered, ancient, as if he had aged a century in an instant. Dr. Howard, our chief medical officer, was discovered in her quarters, regressed to a childlike state, unable to speak or care for herself, her eyes wide and vacant. Crew members began reporting that the automated medical system, AMS, was malfunctioning. I saw it myself, twice. Once operating on a crew member that was completely healthy, making incisions for no reason. The second time, well, I'd rather not think about the second time. The metallic scraping sound it made will haunt me forever. We started locking the doors to the medical bay after that. It was clear now that this entity, Kronos, wasn't just a physical threat. It was something far more insidious. It was warping time, twisting space, and somehow infecting the minds of those it came into contact with. I reviewed the security footage, the few feeds that were still operational, desperate for any glimpse of the entity. Then, on a monitor displaying the corridor outside the sealed lab, I saw Kronos. It wasn't just a blob of flesh. Specific features, horribly human yet utterly wrong, manifested and receded across its surface. A hand, impossibly large, stretched out from the mass, its skin the texture of old parchment, then dissolved only to be replaced by a row of teeth, arranged in a grotesque parody of a human grin. An eye, bloodshot and lidless, peered out from what might have been a shoulder, its gaze somehow conveying both hunger and a chilling emptiness. It didn't move through the corridor like a physical being. Instead, the corridor itself seemed to deform around it, the walls rippling like fabric, the perspective warping as if space itself was being folded and reshaped to accommodate its geometry. One moment it was meters away, the next it was pressing against the camera lens, a kaleidoscope of distorted flesh filling the screen before the feed cut to static. It was a glimpse into an anti-reality, a place where the laws of physics weren't just broken but utterly discarded. It was clear, looking at this footage, that the entity was not simply dangerous because of its physical threat, but that it represented an existential crisis made flesh. That's when I made the decision. The fusion reactor that powers the Black Star. If Kronos is some kind of energy-based life form, and the initial data suggests it is, then maybe we can starve it, or at least cripple it. Not a full shutdown, that would be suicide. Life support, gravity, everything would fail. But a partial shutdown, dropping it to emergency levels, combined with activating the localized containment field around the lab. We're already on borrowed time, and I can't see any other way. We need to buy ourselves some time to figure out how to deal with this thing permanently, without killing ourselves in the process. As I was heading towards the reactor control room, determined to weaken Kronos and contain its spread, I was attacked. In the narrow corridor, a section of the wall rippled, the metal groaning as if under immense pressure. And then it emerged, bursting through the bulkhead like some grotesque parody of birth. A hand, pale and slick, with far too many fingers, each tipped with a nail like yellowed ivory, reached out and grabbed my arm. Its grip was like cold steel, and I could feel something draining from me, my body aging rapidly where it touched my skin, my muscles atrophying, my bones becoming brittle. It felt like my very life force was being siphoned away. A blinding beam of blue light sliced through the darkness, and the creature recoiled. Clara stood there, holding a high-powered laser cutter, normally used for cutting through dense materials during station repairs. "Let's go," she said, her voice tight with urgency. "We need to initiate the partial shutdown and get that containment field up." The near-crippling effects of Kronos' touch on my arm were fading. My bones no longer felt like crumbling chalk, and I could move my fingers without them feeling like they were going to snap. "Right," I said, taking a deep breath. "Reactor first, then containment." We made our way to the reactor control room. We passed other crew members, but there was no semblance of order. Some fled past us, their faces contorted with terror, their eyes wide and unseeing, bumping into walls, not even noticing, just running blindly in a desperate attempt to escape the unseen horrors. Others seemed to have succumbed to the entity's influence, their minds fractured, lost in their own personal hells. One man, a technician I recognized from the engineering section, was crouched in a corner, scribbling on the wall with his own blood, his fingers raw and bleeding, drawing cryptic symbols that writhed before my eyes. He was muttering to himself, a string of nonsensical phrases interspersed with pleas for it to stop, to leave him alone. In a nearby corridor, a woman, one of the science officers, floated a meter above the floor, held in place by some unseen force. Her body was contorted, her limbs flailing, as if she were caught in an invisible vortex. Her screams were high-pitched and piercing, a chilling counterpoint to the groaning of the station. Each encounter was a fresh wave of horror, showcasing the entity's growing power and the utter disintegration of order and sanity on the Black Star. Reaching the reactor control room, we found it surprisingly empty. "Where is everyone?" Clara asked, her eyes scanning the empty consoles, her voice echoing in the unusual stillness. "Hiding," a voice said from behind us. We turned to see Julian Crane, his usual manic energy replaced by a haunted look, as if he had aged a decade in the last few hours. Even he seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. "The sane ones, at least. The others." He trailed off, his eyes drifting towards the reinforced viewing window. He looked at us, a question forming on his lips. "You're not shutting it down completely, are you?" "Partial shutdown. Just enough to weaken Kronos, hopefully, and we're activating a containment field around the lab." Julian nodded slowly. "It's not right, you know," he said, his voice barely above a conversational tone. "It's not natural, but it is fascinating. I just hope we can stop it, or at least contain it, before it consumes the entire station." He looked lost, standing there in his expensive suit, for once not eager to jump into the problem head first. Instead, he looked like a scared kid, completely out of his element. It was probably the first time in his life he didn't have all the answers. "I'll help," he said after a moment. "I know this system better than anyone." Together we initiated the partial shutdown. The reactor's core, visible through the reinforced viewing window, dimmed slightly, its vibrant blue glow fading to a dull azure. The artificial gravity fluctuated wildly for a moment, throwing us off balance before settling at a noticeably lower level. "Containment field," I said, moving to the next console. "Let's hope this works." We activated the containment field, a shimmering, translucent barrier that enveloped the research lab and the surrounding corridors. It wasn't perfect. We could see it straining to maintain its integrity, but it was holding. The station fell into an unsettling state of semi-darkness. The silence was punctuated by the intermittent blare of alarms, the creak and groan of the station's superstructure, and the frantic whispers of the surviving crew. It felt like we were trapped inside a dying beast, its death throes echoing around us. We made our way through the darkened corridors, our way lit by the beams of our emergency headlamps. We found other survivors, grouping them together, trying to offer what little comfort and reassurance we could. But the attacks continued. The temporal and spatial distortions intensified, even with the containment field in place and the reactor at minimal power. One moment, I was walking beside Clara. The next, I was alone in a corridor I didn't recognize, the air thick with a cloying sweetness that made me retch. I saw distorted reflections of myself in the metallic walls, older, younger, sometimes not even human. These weren't just visual hallucinations. I could feel the effects on my body, a dizzying sensation of acceleration and deceleration, as if my internal clock was being constantly reset. During one of these episodes, I saw Dr. Kim, but not the man I knew, the eager young researcher who always had a question, a joke, a ready smile. He was fused to the bulkhead, his body distended, as if the metal itself was consuming him, his skin stretched, almost translucent. One arm was gone entirely, replaced by a mess of wires and tubing that snaked into the wall. His face, once full of youthful energy, was now gaunt. The skin pulled tight against his skull, his lips peeled back in a rictus of pain that exposed his teeth in a horrifying fixed grimace. His one remaining eye, normally bright and inquisitive, was wide, bloodshot, the pupil dilated to an unnatural size. It locked onto mine, and I could see a hint of recognition, of pleading, deep within its depths. "Henry," he tried to say, his voice a dry, rasping sound that came from the wall itself, a ghostly echo of the man he once was. "Help me! It hurts! Make it stop!" His words were garbled, distorted, but the raw agony in them was unmistakable. He reached towards me with his remaining hand, his fingers, now mere skeletal claws, scraping against the metal. I saw the remnants of his lab coat, the one with the slightly torn pocket where he always kept his lucky pen. It was still there, that pen, a heart-breakingly mundane detail amidst the horror. I recoiled, slamming against the opposite wall. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the image, the sound of his voice, but it was seared into my mind. When I dared to open my eyes again, he was gone, vanished as if he had never been there, leaving only the indifferent steel of the corridor in his place. But the memory of his pleading eye, the sound of his voice, those remained. We found a group of survivors huddled in the mess hall. They were trying to use the quantum entanglement communicator, hoping to raise a distress signal, but the black hole's gravity, coupled with Kronos' influence, rendered it mostly useless. All they could manage were bursts of static, interspersed with garbled, fragmented messages that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The emergency lights dimmed and died, plunging the mess hall into near darkness. A collective gasp swept the room, followed by panicked cries. In the center of the room, the darkness congealed, solidifying into an unnatural absence of light. It was Kronos. Not flesh this time, but a tear in the fabric of space, a distortion. Within that distortion, a chaotic jumble of images flashed, other places, other times, assaulting my senses and making my head spin. The entity expanded, a wave of distorted reality radiating outwards from its center. People screamed as they were caught in its area of effect. One crew member aged decades in an instant, his hair turning white, his skin withering, his body collapsing into a pile of dust. Another found herself reliving a traumatic memory. A past mission gone wrong. Her screams echoing through the mess hall as she clawed at her eyes, trying to escape the vivid hallucination. The entity, thankfully, seemed to lose interest in us for the moment, its form dissipating as quickly as it had appeared, leaving behind only a lingering chill and the stench of ozone. We were left in the near darkness, the silence broken only by the sobs of the survivors and the frantic beating of my own heart. Kronos was too powerful, too unpredictable. Even weakened, it was still tearing us apart. We needed a new plan, a way to fight back, or at least a way to escape this dying metal coffin. But how do you fight something that can manipulate time and space? How do you escape something that can bend reality to its will? The answer, I realized, might lie in the very thing that had created this nightmare in the first place. The singularity splicer. We had to try to reverse the process, to sever its connection to our reality, potentially banishing it back to the singularity. It was a long shot, a near impossibility, but we were out of options. "We're not escaping this," Clara said, her voice flat, devoid of hope. We were huddled in the observation deck, the only place on the station that still felt remotely safe. The black hole, Gargantua B, dominated the viewport. "We have to try," I said, though I knew she was probably right. "The splicer. We reverse the process, sever Kronos' connection to our reality. And if we make things worse," Julian asked, "unleash something even more horrific?" It was a valid concern, one that had crossed my mind more than once in the past few hours. "We're already at the bottom of the abyss, Julian. There's nowhere to go but up." I explained my theory. The idea that Kronos was a creature of two worlds, a being born from the fragmented consciousnesses exposed to the exotic particles, trapped between our reality and the singularity. If we can reverse engineer the settings used during the initial experiment, create a sort of anti-splice, we might be able to force it back into the black hole, or at least neutralize the threat. Julian nodded slowly. "It's our only chance," he said, his voice barely above a conversational tone. The journey to the splicer was a descent into a nightmare. The station was falling apart, the corridors twisted and distorted by Kronos' influence. We passed through sections where the artificial gravity had failed completely, forcing us to navigate in 0G, pulling ourselves along handholds, our movements slow and clumsy. We encountered more victims of Kronos' horrific touch. In one corridor, we found a crew member frozen in a time loop, reliving the same agonizing moment of his death over and over again. He was caught in mid-scream, his body half-merged with a bulkhead, his face contorted in a silent shriek. We couldn't help him. We could only move on. The image of his endless torment seared into our minds. In another section, we found the remnants of what used to be a science team. Their bodies fused together into a single mass of flesh and bone. A macabre sculpture of human suffering. The automated medical system machines had been busy as well. We found one of them in a hallway, its metallic arms whirring, its optical sensors glowing red as it performed a horrific surgery on a still-living crew member, its movements precise and methodical, devoid of any semblance of care or compassion. We had to disable it with a well-aimed laser blast from Clara's cutter, the sound of the machine's dying sparks drowned out by the screams of its victim. We used what we had learned about Kronos' behavior to our advantage. We moved quickly through areas of temporal distortion, knowing that the entity had difficulty manifesting in places where time was unstable. We used fire extinguishers to create temporary barriers, the sudden release of compressed gas disrupting Kronos' form, causing it to recoil and dissipate momentarily. And we used flares, the intense light disorienting the entity, giving us precious seconds to move past it. Finally, we reached the research lab. The containment field was barely holding, the energy barrier flickering erratically, like a dying candle flame. We were at the remote access panel, just outside the lab's main entrance. Julian, his face slick with sweat, worked at the controls. "Deactivating now," Julian said, his voice strained. With a final keystroke, the containment field dissolved, the flickering energy barrier vanishing completely. The lab's interior lay before us, a scene of utter devastation. The splicer was a twisted wreck, its components bent and broken, wires dangling from the ceiling like torn intestines. We were exposed, vulnerable, with nothing between us and Kronos. Julian began working on the splicer's control panel. He was a different man now, his arrogance gone, replaced by a grim determination. "I need to recalibrate the targeting matrix," he muttered. "Reverse the polarity of the entanglement field. It's like trying to unscramble an egg, but with higher stakes." He started running simulations, the results displayed on a nearby monitor, showing complex equations and graphs that fluctuated wildly, a visual representation of the chaos we were trying to control. Clara assisted him, her knowledge of astrophysics proving invaluable. She monitored the station's dwindling power reserves, rerouting energy from non-essential systems to the splicer. "We have enough for one shot at this," she said. "One shot to get it right." Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Kronos erupt into the room. It wasn't just flesh this time, but a contortion of space itself, a rip in the fabric of reality. One moment it was a wall of grasping, multi-jointed arms sprouting from a torso that was far too wide. The next it was a localized time dilation, objects caught in its field aging rapidly, metal rusting, plastic decaying into dust in seconds. It was everywhere at once, an omnipresent storm of distorted physics. The black hole, Gargantua B, seemed to have invaded the black star, its chaotic energies made manifest. We fought back using whatever we could. Flares, their intense light momentarily disorienting the entity. Fire extinguishers, the sudden blast of compressed gas pushing back against the warped space, creating pockets of relative normalcy amidst the chaos. "Almost there," Julian said, his voice strained. "Just a few more adjustments." A concentrated distortion of gravity slammed into Julian, throwing him against the console with a ghastly thud and the crack of bone. I saw his body contort, his bones snapping under the force. He gasped, a choked, gurgling sound, his eyes wide with agony, but still he reached for the controls, still trying to complete the sequence. Clara, seeing Julian fall, rushed towards him, laser cutter blazing. She aimed at the spatial distortion surrounding him, the blue beam slicing through the warped space. For a moment, the distortion dissipated, freeing Julian from its grip, but then it reformed, stronger, more aggressive. It lashed out, a concentrated wave of temporal energy. Clara was caught in the field. I watched in horror as she aged before my eyes, her movements slowing, her skin wrinkling, her hair turning white. Decades passed for her in seconds. She screamed, a long, drawn-out wail of agony that was abruptly cut short as she collapsed, her body rapidly decomposing, turning to dust before my eyes. The sight of Clara's death, so sudden, so brutal, filled me with a cold rage. I charged at the distortion, wielding a piece of reinforced metal plating like a club. I struck at the warped space, a futile gesture, but I couldn't just stand there and watch. Then, a blinding light filled the lab. The splicer. Julian, with his last ounce of strength, had initiated the anti-splice. A wave of energy surged from the machine, washing over the room. Kronos, the entity, the distortion, whatever it was, recoiled. It emitted a sound, a shriek that wasn't just noise, but a discordant energy that scrambled my senses, a vibration that felt as though my internal organs were being twisted. The lab was shaking violently now, the entire station groaning under immense stress. The artificial gravity fluctuated wildly, throwing me off my feet. I crawled towards Julian, who lay slumped against the console, his chest no longer moving. His eyes were open, staring blankly at the ceiling, a single tear frozen on his cheek. He was gone. The shaking intensified. The deck plates buckled, the walls groaned, and the ceiling began to collapse. I was thrown around like a rag doll, wreckage raining down on me. I saw a large section of the ceiling give way, and then nothing. Only darkness, the sound of tearing metal, and a crushing pressure before I lost consciousness. The image of Clara's horrified face, frozen in time, imprinted on my mind. I awoke to a bright white light. I was lying in a bed, my body aching, my head pounding. The rhythmic beep of a medical monitor filled the silence. I was in a hospital room, clean and utterly alien after the horrors of the Black Star. A woman in a crisp white uniform entered, wearing a professional smile. "Dr. Dalton?" she said, her voice calm and reassuring. "You're awake. You're safe now. You're back on Earth, at the UED medical facility." Back on Earth. The words felt strange, unreal. I tried to speak, but my throat was dry. What happened?" "We received a highly distorted distress signal from the Black Star. A rescue team was dispatched immediately. They found you unconscious on the station. The only survivor. It's a miracle, really," she added, her professional smile faltering slightly as she adjusted the IV drip. "You've been unconscious for quite some time. We've been monitoring you closely." The only survivor. The weight of those words crashed down on me, a crushing blow. Clara, Julian, the others, all gone, consumed by the abyss I had helped unleash. Over the next few days, I recounted my story to a panel of UED officials and scientists. They listened intently, their faces impassive, their questions sharp and precise. They wanted to know everything about Kronos, about the singularity splicing experiments, about the entity's abilities, its weaknesses. I told them everything, holding nothing back, describing the horrors I had witnessed in excruciating detail. The contorted faces of the victims, the temporal distortions, the spatial anomalies, the way Kronos could manipulate reality itself. I told them about Dr. Kim, about Officer Wilson, about Dr. Howard and countless others. I told them about the attempt to lower the reactor's power to emergency levels, about the unstable containment field, about Julian's sacrifice, and about Clara's agonizing death. They assured me that I was safe now, that the threat was contained, that the Black Star and everything on board had been consumed by Gargantua B, but their empty platitudes offered no solace. I had stared into the abyss, and the abyss had stared back, changing me in ways I was only beginning to understand. They kept repeating I was going to be all right, that I was going to make a full recovery. I wasn't so sure. The physical wounds healed, but the mental scars remained. Nightmares plagued my sleep, vivid, terrifying replays of the events on the Black Star. The faces of the lost, the screams of the dying, the suffocating presence of Kronos, they haunted my waking hours as well. One day, as I was staring out the window at the manicured lawns of the UED facility, a scene so jarringly normal it felt obscene, I noticed a distortion on the wall beside my bed. It was subtle at first, a slight warping of the paint, like a heat haze in the air. But then it grew, becoming more pronounced, more defined. The white paint rippled, taking on a fleshy hue. Shapes began to form within the distortion, faces contorted in agony, their features shifting, melting, reforming. I recognized them. Julian, his eyes wide with terror, his mouth open in a silent scream. Clara, her face frozen in a mask of horror, her skin decaying, turning to dust even as I watched. They were reaching out to me, their hands skeletal and distorted, clawing at the barrier between our realities. I could hear them, not with my ears, but in my mind, their voices a chorus of pain and despair. "Help us!" they pleaded, their voices overlapping, merging into a single anguished cry. "It's not over. It has us." Then a larger shape emerged from within the distortion, a grotesque, multi-fingered hand, its skin a patchwork of colors, its texture shifting between smooth and scaly, hard and soft. It reached out, its touch promising not just death, but oblivion, an erasure of the self. The hand grasped at the faces, pulling them back into the distortion, their screams abruptly cut short. The wall rippled one last time, and then it was smooth again, the white paint pristine, as if nothing had happened. I stared at the wall, my chest tight, each breath a labored effort, my body rigid with a fear I thought I'd left behind on the Black Star. It could have been a hallucination, a delusion, a symptom of my trauma, couldn't it? It had to be. But deep down in the core of my being, a sliver of doubt lingered. They said I was safe. They said it was over. But what if this was just another layer of the nightmare, a construct of Kronos' twisted reality? Was this Earth? The real Earth, the one I remembered? Or was this just another elaborate illusion, a meticulously crafted simulation designed to keep me docile, to keep me from fighting back? Perhaps I was nothing more than a fragment of a broken mind, trapped within the entity's consciousness, destined to relive the horrors of the Black Star for all eternity. Or perhaps I never even left the station. The universe, I was beginning to understand, is not a place of order and reason. It's a vast, chaotic abyss, filled with things beyond human comprehension, things that can break us, consume us, and rewrite our reality. And sometimes the greatest horrors are not the ones we see, but the ones we suspect are waiting for us, just beyond the veil of our perception, in the spaces between the stars, in the silence of our own minds. And sometimes the most terrifying truth of all is that the line between reality and illusion can become so blurred, so distorted, that we can never truly know if we're free, or if we've been trapped all along, never really in control, just a puppet dancing to a tune we can't even hear. The uncertainty, the not knowing, that's what will truly haunt me forever. That maybe this is just the beginning of the nightmare,